Have you ever wondered why the US wants to take the oil in Venezuela and why they're claiming its lands? Why Venezuela is hell-bent on protecting its oil and lands? This tangled web of geopolitics, history, and resource control has simmered for decades, drawing in corporate giants, presidential decrees, and international courts. Let's delve deep into the layers of this dispute, unpacking the motivations, the claims, and the fierce defenses without rushing to any final judgments. The story begins in the early 20th century, when oil was first discovered in Venezuela in significant quantities. Back then, the country was largely agrarian, but the black gold bubbling beneath Lake Maracaibo changed everything. American companies, particularly predecessors to ExxonMobil and Chevron, played a pivotal role in developing Venezuela's oil infrastructure. Standard Oil of New Jersey, which became Exxon, and other U.S. firms invested heavily in exploration, drilling, and refining, turning Venezuela into one of the world's top oil producers by the 1920s. These companies operated under concessions granted by Venezuelan governments, often on favorable terms that allowed them to extract and export vast amounts of crude. By mid-century, Venezuela supplied a significant portion of U.S. oil imports, fueling America's post-World War II boom. This era cemented a perception in some U.S. circles that Venezuelan oil was, in a sense, an extension of American enterprise, built with U.S. capital, technology, and know-how. Fast forward to the 1970s, a time of rising resource nationalism across the global South. In 1976, under President Carlos Andrés Pérez, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry, creating the state-owned Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA. Foreign companies were compensated. Exxon received around $500 million, for instance, and many stayed on as minority partners or service providers. This move was part of a broader OPEC-driven push for sovereignty over natural resources, allowing Venezuela to capture more revenue from its reserves, estimated at over 300 billion barrels, the largest in the world. For Venezuela, this wasn't just about economics. It was about reclaiming control from foreign dominance, funding social programs, and asserting national pride. But for some in the US, it marked the beginning of a grievance. The idea that Venezuela had taken something that American ingenuity had essentially created. The tensions escalated dramatically under Hugo Chavez, who came to power in 1999 on a platform of Bolivarian socialism. Chavez viewed oil as the lifeblood of Venezuela's independence, using petrodollars to fund anti-poverty initiatives like Misiones Sociales. In 2007, he mandated that all oil projects in the Orinoco Belt, the heart of Venezuela's heavy crude reserves, become joint ventures with PDVSA holding at least 60% ownership. Companies like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips refused, leading to the expropriation of their assets. Exxon sought arbitration through the World Bank and won a $1.6 billion award in 2014, though it had sought $10 billion, while ConocoPhillips pursued similar claims. From the U.S. perspective, this was outright theft, billions in investments seized without fair compensation. Venezuelan leaders, however, framed it as correcting historical imbalances, where foreign firms had extracted wealth for decades while leaving the country underdeveloped. Chavez's alliances with China, Russia, and Iran further irked Washington, as loans from Beijing, over $50 billion since 2007, were repaid in oil shipments, diluting U.S. influence. Enter the land claims, which add another explosive dimension. While the U.S. hasn't directly claimed Venezuelan territory as its own, recent rhetoric from figures like President Trump has blurred lines, with statements like, "We're getting land too," in reference to Venezuelan assets. This echoes broader U.S. assertions that Venezuela stole oil fields developed by American companies, implying a moral or historical right to reclaim them. But the real territorial flashpoint involves the Essequibo region, a 62,000 square mile swath of land rich in oil and minerals that Venezuela has claimed since the 19th century, arguing it was unfairly awarded to British Guiana, now Guyana, in an 1899 arbitration. Guyana administers Essequibo, and massive oil discoveries there by ExxonMobil since 2015, over 11 billion barrels, have supercharged the dispute. Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro held a referendum in 2023 claiming the territory, annexing it on paper as Guayana Essequiba, and even planning to elect officials there in 2025. The U.S. has staunchly backed Guyana, conducting joint military exercises and pledging defense support, viewing Venezuelan moves as aggression that threatens regional stability and U.S. energy interests. For Venezuela, defending Essequibo is about historical justice and preventing foreign encroachment on what it sees as its rightful resources. Incidents like a Venezuelan naval incursion into Guyanese waters in March 2025 highlight the ongoing brinkmanship. U.S. motivations run deeper than nostalgia for old concessions. Energy security is key. Venezuela's heavy crude is ideal for U.S. Gulf Coast refineries, and reducing reliance on distant suppliers like Saudi Arabia appeals to America First policies. Sanctions imposed since 2017 under Trump, continued and partially eased under Biden for Chevron operations, aim to pressure Maduro's regime, accused of human rights abuses and electoral fraud. Yet these measures have pushed Venezuela toward adversaries. China now receives much of its oil, and Russian firms like Rosneft have stepped in. Trump's recent blockade on sanctioned tankers entering Venezuela, announced in December 2025, escalates this, ostensibly to combat drug trafficking but tied to broader claims of reclaiming our oil. Advisors like Stephen Miller have echoed that the U.S. has a real claim on Venezuelan oil, rooted in historical development. On Venezuela's side, the defense is unyielding. Maduro portrays U.S. actions as imperial piracy, vowing to continue oil exports despite blockades. The country's military has been mobilized, and alliances with Russia and Iran provide backup. For Venezuelans, protecting oil and land isn't just economic, it's existential, a stand against perceived neocolonialism that has fueled migration crises and economic collapse under sanctions. Social media buzzes with defiance, from claims that U.S. moves are bullying to fears of a proxy war in the Amazon. Meanwhile, incidents like the U.S. seizure of a sanctioned tanker off Venezuela's coast in December 2025 underscore the real-world stakes. As naval forces position and diplomatic cables fly, the interplay of history, power, and resources keeps unfolding, with each side digging in deeper. This pattern of assertive intervention isn't confined to the Caribbean basin. It reflects a long-standing U.S. drive for global dominance, often framed as defending democracy or security but increasingly viewed worldwide as outright bullying. From the Monroe Doctrine's 19th-century roots, which position the Americas as Washington's exclusive sphere, to modern-day sanctions and military posturing, the U.S. has sought to dictate terms on resources, regimes, and alliances across continents. Critics argue this stems from a deep-seated exceptionalism, the belief that American interests supersede sovereignty, leading to over 80 interventions since World War II, from covert coups in Iran, 1953, and Guatemala, 1954, to overt invasions in Iraq, 2003, and Libya, 2011. In Venezuela's case, Trump's December 2025 blockade of sanctioned oil tankers, coupled with threats to get the oil back, exemplifies this approach, portraying nationalizations as theft while ignoring arbitration outcomes like Exxon's $1.6 billion award. Yet, this heavy-handedness is eroding U.S. clout, as nations once on the periphery now band together, leveraging economic interdependence, diplomatic blocs, and alternative institutions to neutralize American pressure. Take China, for instance. Beijing's engagement with Venezuela isn't mere opportunism, it's a calculated pivot in a larger geopolitical chess game. Since 2007, China has extended over $60 billion in loans to Caracas, often repaid in oil shipments that bypass U.S. sanctions, accounting for up to 20% of Venezuela's exports in recent years. This oil-for-loans model, part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, has not only kept Maduro's government afloat amid economic collapse but also challenged the petrodollar's hegemony, with deals increasingly settled in yuan. In December 2025, as Trump escalated with tanker seizures off Venezuela's coast, Chinese foreign ministry statements condemned the moves as unilateral bullying, pledging continued support through infrastructure projects like refineries and ports. Deeper still, this alliance exposes U.S. vulnerabilities: China's rare earth dominance and tech exports to Venezuela, drones, surveillance systems, create dependencies that sanctions can't easily sever, forcing Washington to confront a rival whose GDP now rivals its own and whose no-strings-attached aid appeals to global South nations weary of IMF conditionalities. Russia, too, has mastered the art of turning U.S. aggression into opportunity. Moscow's ties with Caracas date to Chávez's era, but they've intensified under Putin, with Rosneft and other firms stepping into voids left by exiled U.S. companies. By 2025, Russian military advisors and S-300 missile systems bolster Venezuela's defenses, while joint exercises simulate responses to external threats, a direct jab at U.S. naval patrols. In response to Trump's blockade announcement on December 16, 2025, Putin hosted Maduro virtually, vowing to reroute oil via shadow fleets and Arctic routes, evading Western interdiction. This isn't just solidarity, it's strategic symmetry. Russia, sanctioned over Ukraine, mirrors U.S. tactics by exporting defiance, supplying wheat, weapons, and Wagner Group mercenaries, now rebranded, to shield allies. The deeper implication? As the U.S. isolates Venezuela, it inadvertently strengthens the Moscow-Beijing axis, accelerating a multipolar order where BRICS currencies challenge the dollar's reserve status, with Russia pushing de-dollarization pacts that could slash U.S. financial leverage by 30% in the coming decade. India adds another layer to this counterbalancing act, blending pragmatism with non-alignment. As the world's third-largest oil importer, New Delhi has ramped up purchases of discounted Venezuelan crude, circumventing sanctions through third-party refiners and rupee settlements. In 2025 alone, Indian firms like Reliance Industries imported millions of barrels, defying U.S. warnings and underscoring a shift from Washington's orbit. Recall India's abstentions on UN votes condemning Russia's Ukraine actions. Prime Minister Modi's administration frames this as energy security, but it's rooted in historical resentment. U.S. support for Pakistan in the 1971 war and sanctions after India's 1998 nuclear tests bred skepticism. Deeper dives reveal India's Quad participation, with U.S., Japan, Australia, as a hedge, not full allegiance. Instead, it bolsters BRICS forums to advocate for strategic autonomy, hosting summits where Venezuela's plight is debated as emblematic of neo-imperialism. This duality erodes U.S. relevance, as India's tech boom and diaspora influence amplify voices calling out American double standards on human rights and interventionism. Expanding the circle, Brazil under President Lula da Silva exemplifies Latin America's awakening. Once a U.S. ally, Brazil now reinforces borders defensively while criticizing Trump's imperialist blockade, urging diplomatic mediation via the UN. Lula's push for a coordinated BRICS response in December 2025 highlights how U.S. actions unify former rivals. Brazil, despite Essequibo tensions with Venezuela, prioritizes regional stability over Washington's regime change agenda. South Africa, another BRICS pillar, echoes this. Pretoria's ANC government, drawing parallels to apartheid-era U.S. meddling, condemned the blockade at a People's BRICS summit, framing it as an attack on sovereignty that demands collective resistance. Iran's involvement deepens the web. Tehran supplies gasoline and refinery tech to Venezuela, forging a resistance axis that swaps oil for missiles and drones, frustrating U.S. efforts to isolate both nations. Even Saudi Arabia, long a U.S. oil partner, hedges by normalizing ties with Maduro and joining BRICS+, signaling a post-OPEC realignment where petrostates diversify away from dollar-denominated trades. These nations aren't just reacting, they're innovating countermeasures. Cryptocurrencies like Venezuela's Petro, shadow banking networks, and multilateral funds that chip away at U.S. tools like SWIFT exclusions and secondary sanctions. Social media amplifies the narrative. X posts from global influencers decry U.S. bullying as a catalyst for multipolarism, with hashtags like #HandsOffVenezuela trending amid fears of proxy wars. As economic blocs solidify and alliances harden, the ripple effects reshape trade routes, defense pacts, and even cultural exchanges, leaving the U.S. to grapple with a world less amenable to its dictates. This escalating dynamic reveals itself starkly in the latest flashpoints of December 2025, where U.S. actions have veered into direct confrontation, testing the boundaries of international law and provoking a chorus of global rebukes. On December 16, President Trump announced a total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers entering or leaving Venezuela, framing it as a necessary strike against what he called the Maduro regime's funding of drug terrorism, human trafficking, murder, and kidnapping. This move, executed by the U.S. Navy's Fourth Fleet, has already led to tangible intercepts. Just days later, on December 20th, U.S. forces stopped and boarded a second merchant vessel, a Chinese-owned tanker, in international waters off Venezuela's coast, following an earlier seizure of the skipper, a vessel carrying an estimated 1.1 million barrels of Venezuelan crude. Trump justified the blockade by demanding Venezuela return to the United States all of the oil, land, and other assets that they previously stole, echoing claims from advisors like Stephen Miller that the U.S. holds a real claim on Venezuelan oil due to historical American investments in its development. Legal experts, however, decry this as a potential act of war, noting that blockades without congressional authorization or a formal declaration violate U.S. and international norms, potentially exposing American forces to retaliation while straining military resources needed elsewhere, like in the Indo-Pacific. Delving into the blockade's mechanics exposes its aggressive posture. The US has sanctioned over 350 tankers since early 2025, many tied to Russian and Iranian shadow fleets that help Venezuela evade restrictions by rerouting oil through intermediaries like Malaysia or the UAE. The Hyperion, a tanker previously flagged for transporting Russian crude, is poised to test the blockade's enforcement, approaching Venezuelan waters amid heightened naval patrols that Trump boasts as the largest armada ever assembled in the history of South America. Oil markets reacted swiftly, with prices rebounding over 1% from 2021 lows, reflecting fears of supply disruptions. Venezuela exports around 800,000 barrels per day, much of it heavy crude suited for U.S. refineries, yet increasingly diverted to Asia. Chevron, one of the few U.S. firms still operating under a Biden-era license, now under scrutiny, continues loading tankers in Venezuelan ports, highlighting the selective enforcement that spares American interests while targeting foreign competitors. Venezuela's response has been defiant. Maduro vows uninterrupted exports, rerouting via ghost ships and alliances, accusing the U.S. of imperialist piracy that breaches maritime law and could ignite a regional crisis. This brinkmanship amplifies the U.S.'s bullying reputation, particularly as it intersects with broader rivalries. The blockade disproportionately hampers China, which receives up to 60% of Venezuela's oil to repay loans exceeding $60 billion, prompting Beijing to condemn it as unilateral coercion that undermines global energy stability. Analysts draw parallels to potential U.S. responses in a Taiwan Strait crisis, arguing that blockading Venezuela weakens Washington's moral high ground against similar Chinese tactics, potentially emboldening Beijing in the South China Sea where it claims vast resources amid U.S. freedom of navigation operations. Russia, meanwhile, exploits the chaos. Putin has pledged to Maduro alternative shipping routes, including Arctic passages, while deploying more military hardware, such as Su-30 jets and hypersonic missiles, to Venezuelan bases, framing it as a counter to NATO's eastward expansion but effectively creating a hemispheric foothold. India's role grows more nuanced. Despite U.S. pressure, refiners like Reliance have imported record Venezuelan volumes in 2025, settling in rupees to sidestep dollar sanctions, a move that bolsters New Delhi's energy independence while chipping at the petrodollar's dominance. India now accounts for 15% of global oil demand, making its defiance a significant rebuff. Layering in other players, Turkey emerges as a wildcard, with President Erdogan offering Maduro political asylum whispers and facilitating oil trades through Turkish ports, leveraging NATO membership to needle the U.S. while advancing Ankara's Blue Homeland doctrine in the Mediterranean. Cuba, long a Venezuelan ally via Petro-Caribe pacts, has ramped up intelligence sharing and medical aid, viewing U.S. actions as an extension of the 60-year embargo that has cost Havana billions. Recent joint naval drills in the Caribbean signal a mini-axis of resistance. Even OPEC Plus dynamics shift. Saudi Arabia, wary of U.S. favoritism toward shale, has quietly engaged Maduro on production quotas, while the UAE invests in Venezuelan fields, diluting American leverage in a cartel increasingly oriented toward Eurasian markets. Public sentiment boils over on platforms like X, where posts decry the blockade as boat strikes akin to drone warfare, with users highlighting U.S. military casualties in related operations, 104 deaths in anti-drug strikes since 2025, and questioning the ethics of seizing civilian vessels in a bid for resource control. Humanitarian tolls deepen the critique. Sanctions and now the blockade exacerbate Venezuela's crisis, with blackouts, hyperinflation, and a migration wave of over 8 million since 2014 straining neighbors like Colombia and Brazil, who host refugees while navigating U.S. demands for tougher borders. Indigenous communities in the Orinoco Basin suffer from oil spills and militarization, their lands caught in the Essequibo crossfire where Venezuelan troops mass amid Guyana's Exxon-led booms. As diplomatic isolation mounts, evident in UN abstentions from US-backed resolutions, these maneuvers foster innovative evasions, from blockchain-based oil trades to AI-optimized smuggling routes, underscoring how US overreach accelerates the very multipolarity it seeks to contain.